kicked off. So to start us off, I want to say, hi, my name is Tamar. I use she, her pronouns. I am the community organizer here at Cascade, and welcome to the second to last session of the Washington Bike Walk and Roll Summit. We're really thrilled to have you all with us for this session. We're so excited to have folks from around the state and beyond joining us today. And we'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. The summit is virtual, and those participating are joining us from many lands, but we want to acknowledge the land that Cascade Bicycle Club sits on as the traditional home of the Duwamish, Tulalip, Muckleshoot, and Suquamish tribal nations. If you don't know whose land you're on, you can look in the chat after I stop presenting this, and I'll share a link so that you can see what land you're on. And if you, like me, live on Duwamish land, I recommend that you check out the Duwamish Real Rent website, and so that you can pay rent to the land that you sit on. So before we jump into the session, I'd also like to note that we are recording this session. It will be available following the summit. The summit is hosted by Cascade Bicycle Club and Washington Bikes, two sister organizations that are statewide organizations with a shared vision of bicycling for all. Cascade serves bike riders of all ages and abilities throughout Washington state, educating new riders, advocating for safe places to ride, and holding rides and events. Washington Bikes advocates for bicyclist rights, endorses political candidates, holds officials accountable, and works to shape policies that will make bicycling safe and accessible for all. We'd like to thank our sponsors as well, whose collective contributions have enabled us to bring together 15 panels with expert speakers and registration free for all attendees. So thank you to Amazon and the Washington State Department of Transportation. I'll now quickly introduce our session and our keynote panelists and welcome you all to the space. We're in our keynote part 2, Envisioning an Equitable Process. Our panelists, like I said, are Alex Haagaard and Liz Jackson, and you'll join our Monday keynote speakers to discuss key learnings from this audit process that we started at the beginning of the week. By incorporating their auto-ethnographic practices into the audit, they will platform attendees who bring disabled identities, knowledge, and experience to their design process. Together, we'll discuss the harms embedded in the phrase, "Thank you for your feedback," and ensuring that the humans who are traditionally centered in human-centered design instead maintain authority over the knowledge that they provide. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll pass it over to our two panelists. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. It's so nice to be here with everyone today. Before we get started, just in case anybody wasn't present during our keynote earlier this week, I just wanted to start with a brief access statement. I imagine if you've been attending other panels and presentations this week, you may have encountered similar access statements. You know, I think the key thing for this, because we are hoping to be in conversation with each of you, one of the things that we have learned about using Zoom is that if somebody such as myself is talking and people are engaging in the chat on the side, what happens is the chat can override if somebody is using a screen reader. And so what the person who's using a screen reader will experience is both myself speaking, and then overlaid on top of that will be the audio from the chat. So with that, we do want to encourage you to use the chat to be in conversation with us. But if you want to do the incredible thing of giving, you know, either Alex or myself or anybody else in the room, you know, applause or snaps, we just genuinely hope you'll save it for the end so as not to create sort of too much conflict in sort of the audio. Other forms of access needs that may have come up in other access statements, but which Alex and I like to prioritize because we are both neurodivergent and chronically ill. If you want to keep your screens off, great, turn them on. Great. If you need to get up, walk away for any reason, please feel free to do so. You might even actually see Alex or I do that during our own presentations. And also, I just want to take a moment for Alex and myself to describe ourselves. Do you want to go first, Alex?
Sure. So, hey everyone, I'm Alex Haagaard. My pronouns are they, them. I am speaking to you from so-called Kingston, Ontario, which is the unceded territory of the Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississauga peoples. I am a white non-binary person with short, light blonde hair. It's a little bit longer on top and kind of worn and a spike towards the middle. I'm growing out the top bit at the moment, and it's cropped really close at the sides. I've got black plastic rimmed circular eyeglasses. I'm wearing bright orange lipstick and a white sort of oversized dress shirt with a string of jet mourning beads and silver earrings. And I've got a shelf full of plants in the background and a dog wandering around as well.
And I am Liz. I am an olive-skinned white queer person. I'm wearing a bright pink hat that perfectly clashes with Alex's blood red lipstick and a denim shirt. I'm based in a small apartment in New York. Behind me, you can see a little figurine that I call Spare Parts Liz and some imagery of my dog. So, you know, from what we understand this week, there were really a couple of key themes that kept coming up. The first being different definitions around this notion of what is safety. The other theme that really came up is how is it that we can design for folks who are being left out? And this is a lot of the work that Alex and I are doing and what we're going to show you today. So what I'm going to do is in the chat, I'm going to include a link. It is a link that we shared during our keynote. It is of a survey that was provided to us. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. You may not be able to get into that one. Okay, so this is the one. I apologize. And I'll also share it again in a few minutes in case anybody was left out and wasn't able to access it through chat. But this is a survey that we submitted. And at the top of the survey, what we wrote was a series of research audit prompts, right? And the reason that we wanted to work through a survey with you is because this is oftentimes what Alex and I do at the beginning of any sort of research or design process, because it is by analyzing materials that they already have that we can start to figure out where is it that we need to be and where is it that we can start doing the work that we need to do. And so that's really what we're hoping to engage in with you today. And with that, I'm going to throw it to Alex and I'll jump back in momentarily. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. And sorry, my dog is getting huffy because people are in the hallway, which is she does not think is allowed. So I would like to ask if you're able to, all of you, to open up the document, because I have trouble sharing screen and talking and scrolling all at the same time. So I'm going to try my best to give you a page number reference to when I'm speaking about a particular part of the document so that you know where I am and what I'm speaking about. But just one of the aspects of my neurodivergence is that I tend to lose my train of thought very easily if I have sensory distractions like trying to speak and write or scroll or type at the same time. So as Liz said, what we're going to try to do today is a little bit of a demo of the kind of process that we go through when we're at the start of a research consultation process. So often what happens is we're presented with a document somewhat similar to this. This is a little bit different because this is the document that was produced at the end of a research process. So it's sort of summarizing all of what happened. But in a lot of ways, it's similar to the kinds of documents that we review at the start of a research process, because those are often describing the methods, you know, how are stakeholders going to be recruited and engaged? What are the materials that are going to be provided to them? And that's essentially what we do within our research audit processes, is that we look at those methods. We look at how are people going to be recruited? What is the language that's being used to recruit them? What are the recruitment channels? What are the ways that potential research participants are being screened? So what are the characteristics of research participants that are being looked for to rule them in or out of the research study? And what are the ways that they're being segmented? So what are the sort of characteristics they're being grouped by? And then we also look at the actual materials that are being provided. So are there questions that are potentially being left out that are going to miss probably important areas of knowledge that you need to know about from the disabled community, with regard to the theme of this research study. Are there questions that are going to be potentially confusingly worded to people who are neurodivergent or who have intellectual disabilities? Is the language plain and simple enough? And then again, are there sort of more physical access issues with the engagement process? So for example, is the survey screen reader accessible? Are the stakeholder engagement meetings accessible? And so we're going to sort of go through this document and use it as an example of some of the sort of issues and questions that can come up to try and hopefully give you sort of a starting point to start asking these questions for yourself within your own processes when you're reviewing and planning these kinds of studies as well. And so just looking at the first page here, these are the research audit prompts that we sort of posed at the beginning. And I'd love everyone to sort of continue reflecting on these as we go through as well, because essentially they cover a lot of what we're going to be looking at, who essentially gets left out in the way that stakeholders are recruited and what they're asked. And how do we reach the people that we need to who are getting left out, and then how do we make what we're doing, accessible and meaningful to them. And Liz, I don't know, was there anything that you wanted to add sort of before we jump into specifics there?
Do you think that, should we explain real quick, just because once we get going, I feel like we sort of jump into it. Should we just kind of take a moment and explain neglected modes of access and temporal inaccessibility real quick, just so that we can reference it once we're going through?
Yeah, sure. Do you want to sort of jump in and tackle that?
Yeah, so I'm going to take, this is something that Alex had written that I'm going to share with you. And this is just, we also shared this during the keynote this past week. But in terms, what we mean by neglected modes of access is when you're working in accessibility spaces, people tend to get really caught up in what we would construe as being sort of hypervisible forms of disability, hypervisible forms of access. And so immediately it is screen readers. I mean, screen readers have already come up in this conversation. We talk about, image descriptions, we talk about captioning, live captioning versus CART. In terms of mobility, that's another big one. We can kind of mean it in a variety of ways. But what gets left out of that is that these are all spatial forms of access. These are all sort of forms of access that can be kind of thingified, and essentially. And what that leaves out is temporal access, which is the sort of access that you need especially in disabilities and disabled experiences that are less visible, less tangible, disabilities that are probably easily contested. So people that are chronically ill, undiagnosed, people who don't even understand that what they're experiencing is some level of disabled experience. So people who need extra time and need the freedom to come and go from things. And so whereas it can become very simple once you start to do especially ally work, A11Y work, it can be very simple to kind of hone in on the spatial forms of access. What I'm hoping that we'll do here is bring to your attention those more temporal forms of access that also need to be considered, and really kind of consider who gets left out when that gets left out. And so just to sort of give you a quick overview of what we're actually looking at here, if you can all jump to page 7, if you're looking at the bookmarks on the left-hand side of your screen, it would be the bookmark for executive summary. And so this is just an executive summary of what this study was. And so it's a planning study that looked at a particular highway connecting a number of different cities, one very major city with an airport, a lot of freight transportation, but also a large number of smaller cities and sort of mid-sized cities being connected. And it was looking at, sorry, for some reason my page is jumping all over the place here while I'm trying to. This is what I mean by I'm not good at scrolling and typing and talking. All right, there we go. So the study was looking at current conditions, ranging around everything from commuters to freight transportation to
sort of regional public transportation that uses the highway, but also exists on separate infrastructure, and essentially figuring out what the priorities needed to be for improving the highway in the near, mid, and long term. So looking towards, I believe it was 2040 or 2045. And so the parts, so this is first of all, it's an anonymized document because, you know, we wanted this to be sort of general, non-specific, not tied to any particular critique of any particular agency's practices. And we wanted it to, you know, sort of be a safe experience for anyone who might come across it being shared. And we also, so we have also deleted sections of it because we want to focus really on the stakeholder engagement process. And so we're going to jump ahead to the tab called Stakeholder Involvement and Outreach, which is page 13. And so the stakeholder process here was basically broken into two parts. It involved a total of 6 stakeholder meetings, which were held, this was prior to the pandemic, so everything was being held in physical space, so at various locations within the different cities. Sorry, again, it's, I don't know why this is jumping all over the place for me. There we go. So various locations within the different cities, and then an online survey. And so essentially the online survey was somewhat more preliminary and was sort of trying to scope the general attitudes. The stakeholder meetings were a combination of scoping attitudes and also gathering stakeholder responses to criteria that were later developed within the study.
Can I just, I'm going to pause you real quick,
Okay.
Alex. So the font on here just changed. It is, yeah. So if somebody's changing the, I just see it has gone back. If you accidentally change the font, can we just leave it as is because we have the page numbers listed to refer to, and also because a black font across the board is probably going to be more legible to more people. And if you do want to make a copy and paste this into another doc and shift the font there, I would encourage you to do that.
Yeah, totally.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I have a feeling that's why my page was maybe jumping around as well too, and I was sort of losing my place there. But anyway, so we had a combination of in-person sort of smaller scale stakeholder meetings. And again, this is sort of very similar to a lot of, you know, social science design research processes. You have sort of your smaller scale, more qualitative in-depth data, and then you have your large scale survey data. But one person left a comment, and it's actually right towards the end of the document, but it relates to this section, and I'm gonna just jump right to it here because it's a fantastic question, and it really frames a lot of what we're going to be talking about, which is how will people who can access the web find out about the survey? And how will they reach people who don't have web access? If the survey is a tool for finding out about concerns and interests, what other engagement tools can they use to reach people? And I love this question because it is exactly the question that Liz and I were going into this document sort of trying to address. And I don't know, Liz, do you want to talk a little bit about just sort of the issue with internet access in particular?
Yeah, there was actually, I don't know if you can find the link, but there was actually a study that just came up this week in which disabled people in lower income brackets have much lower access to the internet. And so when you are seeking respondents for a survey simply over the internet, you're going to bias who's even aware of it in the first place. And what we find in this survey, and I'm also jumping around on pages too, so you'll have to bear with me. But I'm so sorry. I'll find the page number. As soon as I find the page number, I'll reference it for you. But essentially what they find is that they do have an overrepresentation of people from higher income brackets. And so a lot of that can, you know, essentially be attributed to the ways in which, I'm so sorry, this is like, I'm sorry, my-
Is it jumping around for you too?
There's something, yeah, there's something happening.
I just scrolled.
Here.
I don't know if it's like syncing everyone's scrolls because that's exactly what was happening when I was speaking too. I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I will,
yeah.
You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a separate copy for myself.
Okay.
And scroll
So I
so
found,
it doesn't interrupt everyone's view. And I think maybe that, that might be a good measure, because I don't know why it's doing this, but
Yeah.
if
But
everyone,
I'll read.
sorry.
Yeah, I'll just, while you're doing that, and if anybody else wants to copy into another document, I'm actually going to read what this survey said, which is that the survey population.
Sorry, I just wanted to jump in really quickly to let them know how they can do that easily,
Okay.
because it's a long document. You can't just Control C and
Select
V.
all.
So
Yeah.
if you go to File and then go to Make a Copy, it'll just copy it and open it up in a new tab, and it'll be called Copy of Asynchronous Workshop. So hopefully that'll resolve any issues where if people are clicking or scrolling, I don't know why it seems to be showing us where people are clicking and scrolling, but hopefully that'll allow us to all see and scroll and sort of click around without disrupting things, and it will preserve the bookmarks for you and the page locations. So yeah.
And if you're experiencing sort of any confusion or sort of need to kind of figure out where we're at, will you just kind of write in the comments real quick? I am Tourettic, so my inclination is to sort of plow forward on something. And so I just want to make space in case that is something that anybody needs. Okay, so I am on page 36. And what it essentially says is that the survey population was slightly overweighted in terms of non-minority demographics. 85% identified as white, and 61%, and it was with higher income households essentially, right? And so you have to ask yourself how much of this is attributed simply to the fact that the only outreach that was done was digitally.
And I think there's also a really important question to consider too, which is that even when you're doing digital research, you know, as the question that was asked in the document says, even for those who have access to the internet, you know, how are you reaching them and who are you reaching? Because, you know, very different people engage with very different parts of the internet. And for example, you know, and obviously every city is different, sort of going in with that caveat, in my particular city, you really have to sort of search, you have to go actively searching for a lot of municipal engagement content, like go onto the city website, you know, go onto the regional planning website and sort of engage with things there. And particularly, so there is also a dynamic within my city. My city has a lot of historical buildings. It has a very strong contingent of people involved in the Historical Society. And we have an ongoing battle between developers in my city, people who are fighting for low-income housing, and the people who don't want to do anything that might mar the beauty of our historical facade. And there's sort of this notorious thing, and not to be too down on the Historical Society people, but like, they tend to be very middle class. They're white. They're either professionals or retired. They're not people who are, you know, working irregular hours at a minimum wage job. And so they have a lot of time to be engaged with these municipal processes. And so their perspectives within these processes tend to be outsized. And that's like, it's, you know, it's almost a bit of a trope. It's like a meme within my community that people are like, oh, the Historical Society's at it again. And it's not even that there's anything fundamentally wrong with Historical Society. It's just because of these structural reasons with how the engagement is done, their voices are just heard so much louder within these spaces. And so on the other hand, you know, even as we talk about how a lot of disabled people have less access to the internet, and particularly impoverished, multiply marginalized disabled people have less access to the internet and to digital devices, at the same time, the internet is incredibly important to a lot of disabled people. And I think we talked a little bit about this on Monday, but in particular, certain groups of people, the internet and social media have been really important to. So we've talked a little bit about chronic illness and how that often tends to get neglected within, you know, accessibility and disability policy processes. And there are a lot of reasons for that. And part of it is because chronically ill people have historically been isolated, not just from like mainstream community, from non-disabled community, but they've also been isolated from disabled community. And again, this is not uniform. We talked on Monday about how disability is not a monolith, and nor is chronic illness, but thinking about some of the people with chronic illness who deal with energy limiting conditions, with chronic pain, chronic fatigue, environmental sensitivities, and who are undiagnosed often and therefore struggling without any sort of access to supports or treatments. They historically, disabled people have been institutionalized, and that was a lot of disability rights advocacy and our ideas about what disability rights and disability policy and accessibility and good disability design come from, is the advocacy of those people who were institutionalized and came together within those spaces to advocate for their rights to live within community, to participate fully in society. But because that advocacy came out of that very specific sort of mode of experiencing disability, a lot of times we've sort of tended to miss out on the chronically ill people who were not institutionalized, but they also weren't in non-disabled community because instead they were languishing within their homes. And before social media existed, they didn't even have community with each other. So for people like them, the internet has been a really, really important space for developing sort of coherent culture, identity, and also advocacy. And so for that reason, places like Twitter are a really, really important place to begin engaging with disabled community. And so there are a number of hashtags for the community that are already really well established, where a lot of disability advocates tend to congregate, and it's sort of really easy to reach them, but also to sort of watch the conversations that they're already having and to understand maybe some of the questions that you need to be asking within your research, because this is also something we talked about on Monday and that we'll touch on again, which is how do you know what you don't know? Like how do you even know what research questions you need to be asking until you have this sort of experience grounded within just being within, observing and listening to and reading these communities. And so there are some really good hashtags. And once I stop talking, I will throw some of them up in the chat. But there is CryptoVote. That's sort of one of the most well-known ones. It's gotten a lot of attention over the last few years. And it's around organizing around electoral politics and representing disabled interests within electoral politics. There's also DISCO, which stands for the disability community. It's sort of a very good general hashtag for sort of big tent, all the disabled people who are sort of engaged within this sort of advocacy space, but with very sort of different ranges of experiences and focuses within their work and their personal lives. There is NEIS Void, which is a space specifically for chronically ill people. So it's a really good place to sort of explore some of those sort of under-recognized experiences. Similarly, Actually Autistic and Asking Autistics. Actually Autistic is for autistic people to sort of speak about and share their experiences. Asking Autistics is a great tag because it's specifically meant for people to ask questions of autistics, and that could be autistic people asking others in their community, but it's also specifically intended for people who are coming in and have a question about autistic experience who may not be autistic themselves. The other thing that I wanted to mention is, so there are also, we talked about disability not being a monolith, and when I'm talking about Twitter, I'm talking about people who are disabled, people who are actively engaged with disability as an identity, as a culture, as a community. And that is not going to be all of the disabled people within your communities. They are a very important part to reach, and often they are sort of ironically left out of a lot of research processes, because a lot of organizations tend to reach out either through very medicalized institutions, so like local hospitals, clinics, local charities. And what that does is it reaches out to people who have been sort of exposed to a very medicalized understanding of their own disability. And so it's really important to try and reach out to those people who have that very politicized, that sense of community, that sense of, this is the history of advocacy and this is where we need to go. But again, they are also, not all or even the bulk of disabled people in your community. And I think actually another really important channel to look at are local subreddits, because this is my local subreddit in my city has a number of people on it who they speak about their experiences of disability and inaccessibility in the city, but they are also very clearly not people who, like, they don't say I'm disabled. They talk about their particular condition and the particular experiences of inaccessibility they have, but they don't come out and say, hey, I'm disabled. And they don't, unlike sort of the queer community in my city, where there's a separate subreddit community where people are like, hey, any other queer people on here? Like, you don't get disabled people in my city just going on the local subreddit and being like, hey, any other disabled people? But nonetheless, they are there. And they're the people who are also maybe sort of interested in engaging with local issues. They're particularly interested in like municipal infrastructure, housing. They're interested in all of that, and they have that range of disabled experience, but they're also ones who are maybe getting left out if you focus on either the medicalized channels or sort of going through self-advocacy channels. So I know there's another question, so I'm gonna throw back to you, Liz.
Yeah, so Don wrote and said, I'm listening for your suggestions for engagement off of the internet. Any suggestions for what has been effective without use of the internet? So this is actually something that Alex and I have been doing a lot of work on, especially this past few months, for a few different reasons. One of the things we're trying to figure out is, how do you effectively make a sustainable research pool? And in many ways, we are at the beginning of the process. I think there's a few different elements to this, and I feel bad that we're kind of spending so much time on locating disabled people during this, but I do think also that is probably the thing where so many of us are battling the most. Like, you can't get started until you actually locate us. So you'll remember, Don, that Alex said that people that you locate through the clinic, or people that you locate through sort of the obvious channels, are very likely going to have a medicalized view of disability. Again, these are people, I don't know if you were there during our keynote, but these are people that would very much identify as a person with disability. For the most part, I'm going to say they're going to be very visibly disabled. There are people that are essentially accredited by the clinic, that the clinic, that doctors, that teachers, that people very much believe that they are disabled, and in many ways, oftentimes either seek to fix them or fix something for them. And so, right, there's like a balance that we're trying to create here. So we can go to those typical spaces, whether it's through a diagnosis charity. We can go through hospitals to locate those people. Similarly, like if we are looking for disabled people that have that more political perspective, again, these are the people that really interest us, because they're actually the people that are skeptical of the systems by which you're going to be pulling them into to conduct this research. And these are people who are, for them, increasingly are on digital spaces, and that's not entirely the case. But again, we're still kind of looking for another research pool. And what we have been doing, and I think this is something I've experienced, and I don't know how specific it is to my experience as a New Yorker, but it's what we call the Whisper Network. And essentially what happens for me is I go on the subway, I have my cane, I might ask for a seat, and somebody will ask me what happened, right? Or what's wrong? And I'll say, nothing is wrong, and that will prompt a conversation. And that person oftentimes responds saying, oh, I know somebody who's in a similar situation. This is someone who might be fighting for a diagnosis, isn't fully believed by the clinic. And so essentially what we're trying to kind of figure out how to build right now is, how do you build a Whisper network? And I think one of the most important ways to be effective in a Whisper network is you actually need people that can signal trust to somebody who might confide. And in my case, my cane is something that signals trust. And so in that way, I don't know that a lot of this research can fully, and locating disabled people can fully be done without actual disabled people who are a little bit more politically oriented, who will allow you to kind of get into the roots of spaces in which people might feel rejected or not have that medical orientation, but also aren't yet on digital spaces. And so that's really what we're trying to tap into right now. I don't know if that was helpful. Again, this is something that everybody's trying to figure out at the moment. And this is just the way that we're going about it. So I'm going to throw back to Alex.
Yeah, I think, so one of the other things that we've been looking at, and like with the caveat that we are in very, very preliminary stages of figuring out how to do it, and that there are, I think, potentially really important benefits to research, but also sort of ethical risks around exploitation, the kind of exploitation we've seen in sort of supposed design for social good, the ways in which what is supposed to be designed for social good, what is supposed to be inclusive design, ends up sort of extracting knowledge from marginalized communities and not, you know, not elevating them or centering them or serving them in the ways that it sort of claims to. So with those caveats in mind, one of the things we've been looking towards is how you can essentially build infrastructure. And this is conceptual infrastructure, not, you know, literal roads and things, for research communities. And I think one of the important, this is essentially what Liz is talking about with the Whisper network, and with sort of connecting to people who have their own connections to those marginalized and underrepresented communities, is that establishing those sort of long-term relationships is really, really important. Because if you're coming back and if you have a community that is difficult to reach, that it particularly sort of is not available through digital channels, every time you do a new study and you're trying to reach them, you're sort of doing the work over and over and over again. So this is why we're looking towards this idea of how you can build long-term research communities, because it saves you having to do that work. It essentially can grow into its own Whisper network, that you have this sort of stable pool of people who are consulting on the research, who can then reach out to their own communities and bring people in, and also give you that advice on, again, going back to the question of what is it that you don't know, because that is just like, you know, we tried to give you a really, really broad and shallow overview on Monday, and it was going at, you know, a whirlwind pace, just trying to give you all of these different little ideas of like different things that you maybe need to consider when thinking about reaching disabled people that often tend to get overlooked. And there was so much, and there is so much more that we left out. And those are the kinds of things that you can only build through this sort of long-term sustained engagement. And you can do some of it through, you know, reaching out and doing this kind of what we call digital ethnography, just reading what's being said on these established hashtags on Twitter, potentially establishing your own local hashtags, or again, if sort of your ethics and policy will allow, you know, posting on the subreddit, inviting people into those, you know, municipal websites, but reaching them where they are at. But, you know, you can only do so much, and you can do more by establishing these long-term sort of consultation relationships with members of the community who have traditionally been left out. That being said, I don't know, Liz, do you want to talk a little bit about the ethical concerns that exist with some of those communities that we're looking at?
Yeah, so I just, I'm going to do that. I just saw that Don wrote again. So hi, Don, I feel like we're in conversation. Are you confident that those people you find through clinics are the ones who do not have internet access, and are not white, and are not in the other demographic categories for over 50 years now that does not use digital tools? Perhaps other non-digital surveys are possible. Yeah, I'm absolutely in agreement with you that non-digital surveys are possible. You know, so just a quick kind of background story. I had applied for this grant, and in the process of, in the grant, essentially what we wanted to create was a diagnostic algorithm for chronically ill people, right? So again, we've kind of been thinking about these research pools. And you know, I was trying to figure out how are we going to reach other chronically ill New Yorkers? And that day, I went in. I'm in the process of getting a tattoo right now. It's my diagnostic criteria is something called onion bulb formation. So I'm getting a tattoo of onion bulb formations, and I go in with the tattoo artist, and I explain to her, you know, and what I want to get. And she's like, oh my God, like I'm going through something very similar right now. I don't know what to do. Right. And so these are people who oftentimes couldn't possibly be in long-term surveys, because the medical system has believed them so little that even if we turn to medical systems to ask a medical system to recommend someone like my tattoo artist to us, she would never cross their mind, right? And so these are very much the people that we're trying to reach. They're people that have been oftentimes told it's in their head. You know, and this is, again, we're speaking more here specifically about chronic illness. And when we speak more specifically about chronic illness, that leads us more to temporal inaccessibility rather than spatial, because we're talking about people that are expected to overcome their will rather than people that are expected to overcome their bodies. And so what they require is time and rest rather than to be fixed, essentially. So again, we're operating very speculatively here, but I want to go back to what Alex was saying about ethical concerns. We're working with a large corporation right now, and they essentially sent us their research plan. And in their research plan, they had listed out a series of charities that they wanted to partner with to, again, begin building a research pool from which they could cull information from. And in that research pool was the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And again, it seems obvious on the surface. Like, if you're looking for people that have, under the categories of impairment, mobility type disabilities, like, of course, you're going to want to turn to the Muscular Dystrophy Association. It just seems like the obvious thing. But then, again, this is all, it's what I said at the very beginning of our keynote the last time, and this is all about going deeper. And when you go deeper, what you realize is that last year, the Muscular Dystrophy Association was completely embattled with disabled folks. Is it muscular dystrophy folks? Actually, I don't know what the identity form of muscular dystrophy is.
I don't actually know that they have one. I think it's just people with muscular dystrophy. This is also, this is just a complication. We talked a little bit about this in the last talk, but we use identity first language, but there are also areas, particularly when dealing with specific diagnoses, where you just sort of have to pivot into person first, because its diagnostic language is just doesn't really have identity-based equivalents.
So so essentially, when this large corporation reached out to the Muscular Dystrophy Association, what they didn't realize that they were doing is that they were reaching people who within MDA that aren't pushing back, who are kind of more comfortable under the constraints of the way the Muscular Dystrophy Association operates. And essentially what they did is this entire sort of research process maligned itself toward people that actually, sociologists, researchers, designers with muscular dystrophy, the people that really not only have that lived experience, but use that lived experience as an entry point into doing this work more deeply. And essentially what that research process did is it prevented them from reaching the people that they ultimately want to access. And so, with us, the thing that we're trying to figure out is how is it that you can reach these people without going through the sort of traditional and expected charitable channels, because through those channels, it's become harder, and it's only going to become even harder to find people who are actually going to provide valuable information. And
so I actually want to pivot into talking a little bit about some of the sort of practical considerations for planning engagement, both sort of in person and online. But I also do want to note in response to your question, Dawn, that I think it's really important to consider the distinction between people who may have a preference, an inclination, an ability to engage with a particular form of engagement. Sorry, that was redundant. To engage either online or offline, and those who essentially are limited to one form or the other. So there are probably going to be a lot of people who would be able to participate in physically in-person research processes. There are also probably a lot of people who might even have a preference for that, who are not comfortable with online. Like, I'm thinking of my dad. He's older, he grew up in rural Denmark. He is not in any way comfortable with using a computer. And he has one. He's trying to practice it. He's learning how to use it, but it's not somewhere that he feels comfortable. It's not somewhere that he'd be able to, coherently share his thoughts and feelings about anything, because he'd be so distracted by trying to just get through the interface. So for him, like, there's a definite strong preference, and even potentially sort of an access need in terms of the fact that he's better able to express himself offline. But that's, again, still a very different category from the people who simply do not have access to online, because, for example, they may be living in assisted living facilities where they may be too impoverished to own a device, or there may be sort of institutional rules around having access to their devices. I think we sort of can't underestimate how regulated people's lives are when they live in assisted living facilities or other sort of institutions for disabled people. And again, these people are often the most vulnerable people within our communities. They're disproportionately racialized. They tend to be the people with intellectual disabilities who are devalued, honestly, even within disability advocacy spaces. And so it is sort of the utmost importance to reach them, because they're the ones who are never reached, even by a lot of work that we do within the disabled community. And so to reach people like them, I think first of all, this idea of the long-term communities, that is part of what you can do, because as flawed as the disabled community is, they still have better reach into those areas. For example, we know people who do a lot of work with and for and on behalf of intellectually disabled people. They're intellectually disabled themselves, but they live independently, but they advocate on behalf of those who do not live independently. So there are, again, it's that whisper network. It's reaching further and further sort of through the layers to the people who have been unreachable. And also reaching out to independent living centers. They're a little bit different than sort of charities, and they are often sources of really, really important support and community within cities for disabled people. They're places where people can go to get services, but they're oriented much more towards disability rights, because their focus is on supporting people to live independently in the community. So they have a much more sort of disability civil rights oriented focus than charities, which tend to be very medicalized and like, let's fix what's wrong with your body. So they tend to have a better reputation within the disabled community, but they also tend to reach a lot of those people who are especially marginalized and who are struggling to live independently. So they're a great resource to reach out to. I also want to talk about the opposite, which is the people who can't do in-person stuff, which is people like me. I was housebound for 3 years. I was narcoleptic. I was sleeping upwards of 14 to 16 hours a day, and it was never the same 14 to 16 hours a day, which made it hard to live. You can't really do anything when you can't reliably be awake from 9 to 5. It makes it impossible to do everything from apply for welfare benefits, to obviously hold down a job, to go to the doctor's office and get medications, to get groceries. And it becomes even more difficult when you have your license revoked, because you can't stay conscious reliably. And you live in sort of a small bedroom community of a large city, which does not have transit. There was a bus that stopped about 1 kilometer away from my parents' house, which I couldn't walk that far at the time. It's still a struggle for me to walk that far now. But if I could get to that bus stop, there's a bus that would take me to the town library. There was not a bus that would take me back to my parents' house. So I could just get to the library and then just stay there until someone picked me up. So for me, physical gatherings, like I could not have come to any of these stakeholder meetings that are described I'm on section 3.2 of Appendix A. We are on page 35 at the moment. So actually just a little bit up from where Liz was speaking. And it is the stakeholder input section just under Appendix A. So I could not have made it to any of these meetings, first of all, because I had no way to get there. But also, even now, I live independently now. I've regained my driver's license. I can remain conscious pretty reliably most of the time. But even so, I deal with severe energy limitation. If I go somewhere, if I go to an appointment in a week. That's me pretty much done in for doing things physically for the week. That's like, I get one appointment a week, one errand a week, and then that's pretty much it. I struggle even to do calls because I just become that fatigued. And so we shared, I think, a blog post earlier this week. Liz, do you mind sharing it in the chat again? I talked a little bit about that experience.
It's at the top of the chat, but I'll do it again.
Perfect. That experience of living in what I call temporal poverty, which is that when you just never have enough time or energy, you have to make really difficult choices about what you engage with. And so anything that is not strictly necessary for me to get my meds or get my groceries, or that's pretty much it. I don't go to those things. I don't socialize. So for me, online events, online ways of outreach are absolutely essential. And so I think one thing that's important to keep in mind is that you need to balance these modalities, and also the way that, you also need to balance sort of this quantitative engagement between online and offline, because we have this division where we sort of do the qualitative, in-depth, longer-term engagement in person, and we do the larger scale, quantitative, shallower overview investigations online. And it makes sense because each of those kinds of spaces has sort of affordances, lends itself to these kinds of engagement. But at the same time, you're sort of reaching distinct populations with each. And so you need to find ways to actually do both kinds of engagement within both spaces. And I think just also thinking about some of the practicalities of how to do these forms of engagement in fairly accessible ways. I think one of the things that was really interesting to me with these stakeholder meetings was thinking about, so it didn't mention the time that these meetings were held at, but just going off of when municipal meetings tend to be held within my region, when municipal meetings that I've attended way in the past before my chronic illness was, as intense, they're generally held in the evening. And that makes sense in a lot of ways because, it's not requiring people who work normal 9-to-5 jobs, at least, to take time off work in order to attend. And that's really important. But at the same time, paratransit services, if you've got someone who relies on paratransit, who cannot take regular city transit, who does not have a car, who cannot walk or roll or bike to the meeting, paratransit tends to have very limited hours. It does not run as late as buses. Depending on the city, it may not run after 6 or 7 or 8 p.m. And also the thing with paratransit is that you often have to book like 2 or 3 weeks in advance, if not more, again, depending on the city. But this is a really common issue in every city that I've ever known someone who used paratransit, is that you have to book it weeks in advance. And so again, depending on when and how these meetings were announced, it's possible that people simply could not have gotten to them if they rely on paratransit, which is like a really important factor to consider, and yet often isn't.
I'm going to jump. Yeah, I want to jump in real quick. So we've got 5 minutes left, and before you jump to the next thing, I wanted to kind of hone in on one thing here, which is the other thing is when you read through this doc, what they do is it shows you a graph of when the higher traffic hours are. And so while we don't know when these stakeholder meetings took place, if they took place not later in the evening when paratransit is not accessible or when it's too late for somebody who's chronically ill to come, if it happens in those arcs when the higher traffic happens, and which also in the document they said that people will go out of their way to avoid traveling during that time, essentially you can be assured that people who are going to be more worn out by a higher traffic, by waiting in traffic, will also be prevented from attending these stakeholder meetings too. And so it's interesting to see the way that this document could possibly show how it would limit who would actually attend.
Yeah, and
I've got one more thing I wanted to point out.
Yes, go for it, because I'm trying to find a document that I'd wanted to link people to. So go for it.
Okay. So the last thing I want to share is whatever, I don't care. So we were in conversation, we were approached by Twitter, I don't know, some months ago, and they wanted to, I can't remember, I think it was Twitter Spaces. They wanted to know if we would essentially beta test Twitter Spaces. And essentially what Twitter Spaces is, it's a room that people can go in and speak. Twitter Spaces happens in real time, whereas the benefit to Twitter for Alex and myself is the atemporality of it. And so what we told them is that Twitter Spaces is inaccessible to us. And so instead of showing interest in the fact that Alex and I were honest about the fact that we wouldn't use Twitter Spaces because of the ways it's inaccessible to us, they just said, oh, well, then you're not relevant to this accessibility work that we're doing. And essentially what this document did was something similar, which is that it said that it only, for the research respondents, it only brought in, or it only surveyed people who actually currently use this corridor. And seemed to have taken very little interest in why there are some people who are not using the corridor. And that is just one of many ways in which I think that's like probably one of the initial ways in which disabled people get left out is that they don't get considered for something that they're not using without considering why they're not using it. But I'm going to throw back to Alex.
Yeah, and so I found the link. It's actually linked to the outline that we provided Monday, which I'm still trying to find. I can't find that one, but I'm just going to link the document directly. So this is actually also a great example of how research can happen on Twitter. So what actually happened was I was having a conversation like about 2 years ago with another colleague, and we were just talking about how many things tend to get overlooked around access planning for physical in-person events. And so we sort of just started listing things, and it was ballooning. And often what I like, the way I use my Twitter is I will be thinking about something or talking about something at work, and I just tweet out whatever I'm thinking or talking about. And sometimes cool conversations happen with the disabled people who follow me and who I follow. So anyway, what happened that day was I essentially tweeted that I was thinking about all of the different kinds of access needs that actually really frequently get overlooked within access planning. You know, at best, you sort of have consideration of like maybe providing ramps and push buttons for doors and like maybe captioning and sign language. You know, that's about it. And not always that. And not always that, like, you know, in an adequate way. So for example, there may be a push button, but you know, it might not work properly, or there'll be a push button for one door, but then not for the next one, things like that. But there are also kinds of access needs that are just never thought about at all. And I get into that a little bit within the piece on temporal access that Liz linked. And I talk about how, in particular, this idea of temporal access doesn't get thought about at all because we focus on the accessibility of spaces. But in this Twitter thread, I was like, just asking people, what are the access needs that you have that tend to get overlooked? And I was not expecting this. I got like 500 replies from people. And what was really incredible was there was a researcher from the UK who was following me and who compiled it into a PDF document with a list of just things to consider. And it's never going to be comprehensive, but it's a good list of things to consider that often get left out. And so that is what I've linked you there. That is the document that this researcher from the UK put together after this was something she'd been thinking about and trying to advocate for within her own institution, came across my Twitter thread and was like, hey, this is useful, but also kind of hard to navigate because one of the limitations of Twitter is it can be cognitively inaccessible. So she compiled it into a more cognitively accessible format and somewhat screen reader accessible. I want to note that it's not fully accessible. It's not tagged and structured in a great way, but it should be at the very least legible, if not great for navigating. And we're at 4:30, so I'm going to stop talking now. I tend to ramble. So yeah, graceful exit there.
Thank you both. I wish we had more time. I wish we weren't at time, but thank you so much. I think this gives everyone here a lot to think about and take into the work we do every day and actionalize. I don't think that's the word, but make actionable. I really appreciate all of your time, all of the work that went into this, all of the work you do every day, and thank everyone who's here for being in this space and participating. Our last session of the summit will be at 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So an hour and a half, I think, from now. It'll be progress towards the safe system. I'm also dropping now a link to our summit feedback in the chat if you want to take a look at that and share your thoughts on this session and any others that you've been a part of. And again, Alex, Liz, thank you both so much. Really appreciate your time today and hope to see the rest of you at 3 p.m. Pacific time. So thanks.
Thank you so much.
And I put our Twitter handles in there if you wanted to kind of ask us a question or if you needed any clarity. I know we went sort of quick. So thank you.
Perfect. Thanks again. Bye, everyone.